So earlier this year, I started noticing this sort of weird pattern amongst my guitar playing friends, and it always stemmed from a similar conversation, the likes of which I didn't necessarily expect. You see, it would start with me asking a very normal question. What gear have you been geeking out on more recently? And the more I asked, the more I would notice a very consistent answer. They would all tell me that they had been absolutely obsessing over the Gibson Les Paul. Now, for most people, this might have been a pretty normal response, but for me hearing this, let's just say it felt a little weird, to say the least. You see, a pretty common trope amongst the younger generation of guitar players is that Les Pauls are sort of dying out. Now, that's being a bit hyperbolic, but kind of a trope nonetheless. It's not necessarily in 100% of cases, and as someone who's actually owned multiples over the years, I wouldn't even call myself the main culprit. But I do know for a fact that I'm definitely not the guy who at any point would have called himself in the last 8 years like a main Les Paul guy, like that's my main thing over a Strat. However, with all of my friends not only turning to this instrument, but actively trying to get me to turn to the dark side, I started to feel this sort of curiosity, the likes of which I felt like I had never felt before. And so I started this deep dive, and interestingly enough, the longer that I went, I noticed the further I got away from Gibson. I started to go away from the more traditional route, and I started to look into some of the heritages and the Eastmans, all of these guitars that people actively say have taken them away from Gibson, and a lot of people say have convinced them that these are like the real Les Pauls. But here's the deal. Whilst realizing I did all this research, more recently I noticed that I'd forgotten to do the one thing that was the most integral to this entire learning process. Actively put these guitars up against each other. And what I found once I finally put them back to back to back, well, let me show you instead of just telling you. So I think that it's most important that we start with the control. That being, in this case, the Gibson makes sense, right? For most people, this is really what started it all, and I'm no exception. Even going back further before I started playing guitar, just seeing this iconic body shape on something like Guitar Hero 3 probably subconsciously really had an effect on me. And if we zoom in specifically to the Les Paul standard line, this is really the guitar that most of my friends who were telling me about Les Pauls this entire year were referring to. And for me, this has kind of always been the standard for Les Pauls, and let me explain what I mean. A lot of people, they like their custom shops and they like their Murphy Labs, and I'm sure with 99% accuracy because they're double the price that they're better guitars than this. But in terms of going from something like a Les Paul Studio that has all of the frills that some people like and some people don't, that being the coil splits, the phase, some things that really completely turn people off from Gibsons, not saying necessarily myself, this is kind of where you get both looks-wise and functionality into just being a real Les Paul's Les Paul. Especially with the last Les Paul that I really checked out, having been the Studio, playing this, all of that was abundantly evident. Outside of just the way it sounds or the way it plays, there are a bunch of other standards, pun intended, that these guitars set in terms of what people are looking for when it comes to a Les Paul style guitar in the right under $3,000 price range. Everything from the weight to the nitro finish to the general overall look of this guitar, which is probably the thing amongst the three guitars that I found to be the biggest pros amongst going with the Gibsons. This thing looks absolutely fantastic. I had zero complaints, especially with this guitar in particular being the Bourbon Burst model. I thought to myself when I started playing this, especially since this is the last of the three that I got, if it were just all of these guitars sounded exactly the same, like one-to-one exactly the same, and they all felt the same, there would be no reason at all to go with anything other than the Gibson. But fortunately for us in the gear-loving community, not everything is always one-to-one, and sometimes you get to experience or you get curious about different guitars who amongst their fan bases might even have a higher reputation than those with Gibson on the headstock, and that is where I kind of discovered this second guitar. This is a Heritage, and they were a company that were originally started after Gibson left their original factory in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And because of that, a lot of their fan base believes them to be the real Les Paul. And everything about their sort of word-of-mouth marketing points to that fact. You'll always hear, these are the guitars that are made in the original Kalamazoo factory. These are the guitars that are made in the original factory. This is what Gibson was before they changed. Now, just like having the name Gibson on the headstock carries a lot of weight, pun intended again, there also is a lot of weight in not having the Gibson logo on the headstock. For a lot of players, having something like this really feels like you're on the in. You kind of feel like all of those sheeple over there, they have their Gibsons, they're sticking with the big dogs, the big companies, but we really know what's up. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. That's inherently just kind of what comes with the territory. But what really matters is once you start playing this thing and actually seeing what goes into it. And trust me, there's a lot. Because when it comes to surface level specs, pretty much everything about this guitar right here is exactly the same, if not just slightly different from the Gibson Les Paul Standard. When I started researching it, the scale length, the nitro finish, the radius on the neck, the rosewood fretboard, it's all exactly the same as the Les Paul Standard. So what in my mind would make it different? And that's where we get into a few things, the first of which being the sound. Now, of the three guitars, after having played them back to back to back a couple of times, this was without question the one that sounded closest to the Gibson. Now, if I'm being completely honest, which tone I like the best, I felt like this one, even with the Gibson having newer strings, just sounded a hair better. And that's where things got really interesting, because this guitar in particular is a Heritage H150. Now, Heritage, like Gibson, has many different models. There's the Les Paul Prophecies, there's the Les Paul Murphy Lab, but with Heritages, specifically with the H150 versus the Bourbon Burst, this guitar is $800 cheaper than the Gibson Les Paul Standard. And that, friends, is a big difference. Now, Heritage does have the H150 Mark II, I believe that it's called, that just released, that is closer to Gibson in the price range, that is, I believe, $25.99, that has higher specs than this. But the question now becomes, if this guitar sounds better, even if it's just a little bit better, and it's $800 cheaper, why wouldn't this be the obvious option? Because even looking at the body, like, this is absolutely beautiful with the lemon burst. And for a lot of players, even some of the ones that I've talked to, it really all comes down to this right here. I'm trying to make this video as honest as possible. I want to give you all of my honest opinions on everything. This is really ugly. And if you ever meet a guitar player that tries to tell you that looks on a guitar don't matter, it's all about sound, it's all about feel, they are blatantly, objectively lying to you. And with that being said, going back to the overall question of the Heritage versus the Les Paul Standard, for a lot of people, it's going to just come down to, are you able to deal with this headstock? Now, me personally, the answer is yes, simply because I think this has grown on me quite a bit. It kind of feels really unique, even though I would never say that I like this look more than the Les Paul Standard. This can grow on me to the point of kind of like not having the Gibson logo on the headstock. It just feels really special and really one of a kind, like you're playing something similar to a Gibson, but not exactly that. Just like with the Les Paul Standards, outside of just the looks, there is the resale value that comes into play, and nothing is ever going to have the same resale value as something with a Gibson on the headstock, because regardless of how good these guitars or any of the other Les Paul alternatives will be, Gibsons will always be the benchmark and will always be what a majority of people buy. But that being said, Heritages aren't the only guitars with resale value that people necessarily have to worry about or think about, because there is another. This is an Eastman SV59V. Now, I've known about Eastman a lot longer than I actually knew about Heritage, because I owned a few of their acoustics, and just from having seen their 335 alternatives, and people have very high regards for these guitars right here. And once I had played it a couple times, I could figure out exactly why. Now, the Eastman was probably the most interesting of these three guitars, simply because it was more far removed from the Les Paul Standard than the Heritage was, and even looks-wise, it had its own flavor. It doesn't have the pick guard, it has a completely different logo, and even the body shape is more different than the Standard than the Heritage. Now, as expected, much like the Heritage, this is also cheaper than the Les Paul Standard by about $200. But the thing that really got me outside of the sound was just the general look of this thing. I mean, with the relic part, that was a gigantic plus. I think this guitar looks absolutely phenomenal. I think in a lot of ways, the Eastmans are able to achieve what the Heritage guitars really can't. That being, they're able to make it different than the Les Paul, like give it a completely different look outside of just the headstock, while still making it just look phenomenal. I mean, just the curve on the top, and like I said, this little relic portion, something so little that makes such a big difference. Obviously, with any guitar, the looks weren't going to be everything that mattered, even if that played a big portion, because I had to start playing this thing once I got it and actually seeing how it sounded. Like I was talking about at the beginning of this, the Eastman was probably the most interesting of the three, and it's more than just the fact that you get an ebony fretboard at $25.99, which is absolutely insane. But when it came to actually hearing the sound of this guitar, it was the most different of the three as well. Simply switching back and forth between all three guitars, I felt like I noticed a small, like very small differences between the Heritage and the Les Paul Standard, but every time I picked up this thing, it was a completely different feel, and a feel that I didn't necessarily like or dislike. It was just different. The thing that I didn't necessarily love with this one, and it may just have been the specific setup coming from Eastman or Sweetwater or whoever, was, of the three, the setup on this guitar was probably the worst. It does have an effect, because everything has an effect. And much like the Heritage, there were a couple of other things that I began to notice, like both this and the Heritage have a bone nut, whereas the Les Paul Standard has a Graphtec nut. And those little things can add up to both sound and playability. But even with the sound being different on this guitar, I just kept coming back over and over and over again to just how crazy cool the look of this thing was, the ebony fretboard, and how if we're strictly talking the alternatives outside of the standard, I think this completely blows the Heritage out of the water. But like we've been saying this whole time, no one variable accounts for everything, and none of this would even matter until I actually took these guitars, not even just in a one-on-one scenario, but all three back to back to back, and actually see how they sounded to make a much more properly and informed decision. Choosing between Les Paul alternatives and just mainstream guitar alternatives in general, I feel like there's a lot of nuance that sometimes we don't give credit for, much like with tube amps versus like going with a quad cortex or something like a Helix. It's not always just about what sounds better. Because to my ears sonically, there wasn't so much of a drastic difference that you absolutely feel like the Gibson is better than the Heritage or the Heritage is better than the Eastman, even though, like I said, to my ears, the Eastman did sound a bit differently. I think it comes down to a lot of factors outside of the tone. I think all three of them have definitive pros and cons, but if I were to be completely honest, if I were to start with which one is the best bang for your buck, I'd probably go with the Heritage. And I know that Eastman makes an SB59 that's like $19.99 without the relic. Probably a little closer to this, but I cannot get over how good this guitar feels. But even if saying that, if looks were more important to me and if I wanted more of like the legacy and honestly, potentially if someone wanted to resell something, obviously, the Les Paul Standard definitely beats the Heritage in looks, even if I like the feel of that one a little bit more. But if I wanted a pure alternative that looked a little bit more different than even the Heritage, and I like the Relic look, like there's nothing you can get in that price range quite like the Eastman, which also, like this thing looks hot. But I think it really just comes down to what the individual player is looking for and what's most important to you. And I think one of the things that I really loved about this whole process is I was able to more pinpoint what was important to me and what I liked. But I don't think it matters what I like. What matters is what you like and what you think. So please let me know, when it comes to the Les Pauls, when it comes to finding the perfect Les Paul and or Les Paul alternative, what do you think? Who do you think makes the real Les Paul? Let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I think with me having done so many experiments and having learned from so many different people about different styles of Les Pauls this year, this did feel like a long time coming. But if you want to know anything more about the Les Paul Standard or any of the other Les Pauls that we saw in this video, got this from the homies at Sweetwater. The links will be in the description. Make sure to check them out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel, if that's something you want to do. Or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that we used in this video, the quad cortex, the mics, heck, even the camera, make sure to check out those links. Also, thank you so much to all my patrons. There's some extra exclusive content on there if you want to join the community. Like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, like most important of all, have a fantastic night.